Thank you for tuning in to another episode of One More Story. We are back and hoping to reach even more listeners in Season 2, so please, if you are enjoying the show, be sure to leave us a review and share with your friends. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's episode. My guest tonight is Rachel Noll James. She is an award-winning filmmaker, actor, and screenwriter, and the co-founder of the female-focused production company Emergence Films. Her latest film, Inheritance, which she wrote, produced, and starred in, premiered at the Dances with Films Festival in June and was just picked up for distribution. Is that right?
Yeah, yep.
Congratulations. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congrats on getting distribution. That's a big step.
Thank you. Yes, we're very excited.
So I want to, you're not in LA, correct?
That is correct.
And you haven't been for some time. So tell us a little bit about, because I feel like you've been busier since you left LA.
I know. It's wild. And, so I left LA in 2017.
Okay.
And it was for Washington. So I moved up to Bainbridge Island, which is a 30-minute ferry ride from downtown Seattle. It was a hard decision for me because, how it is when you're in LA. It's like we're taught to believe that if we want to do this work, we have to be in LA. And I believed that. And I spent, over 10 years in LA believing that and doing everything I could to make that happen. And so when I started realizing that I really did not want to live there anymore, I was really afraid that moving would mean kind of giving up on the dream or losing the momentum I'd built or, all the fearful thoughts that come up. But actually, it's been, to your point, the exact opposite. I moved up into this incredible creative community that is filled with people who love the arts, support the arts, are artists. Like, this island is full of the most incredible people who've come from LA, have come from our industry, from other industries, and then just people who have a lot of money that want to spend it on, furthering and supporting the arts in the area. And so I kind of found myself in this incredible pocket where people were interested in supporting my films as art instead of as like an investment, commodity to make money off of. Like, obviously we all hope we'll make money off of films, but It's just a different mindset. And it kind of opened up a whole new, creative inspiration for me. I was feeling pretty burnt out when I moved up here and kind of just re-energized me to make art again and remember why I love this. And it's kind of grown from there.
So what was the point? Was there a specific moment where you decided, you know what, I'm done. I'm done in LA. I got to get out of here. I got to make a fresh start.
So there's two things I can point to. One was, so my husband and I lived in an apartment in Studio City, and the summer before we left, we had this cute little house right next to our apartment building that they tore down and then proceeded to build a 4-story condo building. And this was like, I could reach out from our bedroom window and like touch the construction site. So just that level of just noise and chaos all the time was. And then I developed this like sty on my eye that wouldn't go away for like 6 months. It was bizarre. So in the midst of all of that, I went up and visited my parents, and they live about an hour from me now in a place called Port Townsend. And I was having drinks with my mom, and I was kind of just like, man, I wish that where you guys lived was closer to a city. And, I just feel like I would love to live somewhere like this. And my mom said, well, what about Bainbridge Island? Kind of just in a joking way. And I was like, yeah, haha. And then as I was traveling back home to LA, the thought just wouldn't get out of my head. And then by the time I got home, I like very nervously went up to my husband and was like, would you ever maybe consider moving away from LA? And he was like, yeah, where do you want to go?
Wow.
I was like, seriously? And we moved like 4 months later.
Yeah, I'm still living in the same area.
Yeah.
Not too far from your construction site apartment scenario. And, I can attest it's a lot, Is there something to the aesthetic of Bainbridge Island and the pace that helps your creativity?
Oh my God, 1000%. So this island is incredible. So it's basically within a 5-minute drive, I can get to the ocean. I can get to the forest. I can see mountains, and the weather is so, moody and, because me, Pete, this kind of stuff I like to write is very moody and atmospheric. And so this place just kind of reached out its arms, and everything now wants to be set here. So, looking out my window right now, I see trees and it's quiet. And if I need a break, I can literally go out and walk in the forest So it's it's hard. And I will say this though, like when we left LA, it was also that time period where like the weather was so hot. Like I remember that year it was like 90 degrees in December and it like never rained. And then the fires were going crazy. I feel like at least since then you guys have that beautiful weather back where at least you have some green and some rain again.
Yeah, we did. We had quite a bit of rain this past winter. I mean, right now it's back to bone dry again and very hot. I mean, this is my least favorite time of year in LA, especially in the Valley. But in general, it has been better. I do remember when you left that time period, it was pretty brutal. And I remember taking my kids to school, and there were air quality warnings, and they were wearing masks just so they wouldn't start coughing. You know.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And I've considered getting out of here at some point, but my kids love LA.
Do they? Well, it's all they've known, right?
It's all that. Yeah. My son said to me the other day, he's like, yeah, when I get older, I want to live in the Valley. I want to and I was like, okay, all right, you're a Valley kid. But I do feel like the hotter weather, at least for me personally, is harder for creative work.
Yes.
So you can't get comfortable. You can't get a sweatshirt on. You can't put your slippers on. You can't have that hot
tea.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing I realized moving up here, because I grew up in New Mexico and then I moved to Los Angeles and then I moved up here and I was like, oh, I'm not a desert person. Haha. Funny about that. Like, I love it. I love the mist and the rain, and this is so much more my vibe.
I want to know more about Emergence Films, which is the production company you co-founded. Tell me a little bit about how that got started and your partnership in that.
Yeah. So, I moved out to LA originally to be an actor. And the first few years I was out in LA, I was doing that audition actor grind, and it's hard. And I was finding myself confronted with not a lot of very interesting roles and a lot of driving and a lot of rejection and, the thing all actors go through. And that kind of propelled me into learning how to write. And then I kind of fell into an opportunity to produce. And kind of through those years, once I got into actually, writing and producing films and doing my own stuff, going into meetings and pitching projects, or even being on set, being like one of, maybe two women on set, whether it was as an actor or as a producer or crew or whatever, and just seeing the dynamics at play, and especially how difficult it was to get funding, how difficult it was to get opportunities to further kind of, well, what have you done? Well, I haven't directed anything yet. We'll come back to us when you've directed something. It's like, well, how do I direct something if nobody will fund me? So it's like that constant chicken and the egg, which I know we all go through. But there were a lot of times where it felt specifically like I was getting no's because I was a woman. And that was really frustrating because I can't change that, obviously. So Sienna, my co-founder, she and I actually went to college together, and we kind of bonded over this desire to create more female-forward content and to support female filmmakers in any way we could, and to kind of be a voice for changing this dynamic that we'd both experienced, because she came from kind of first AD producing production crew background. So we founded the company, and we continued to kind of do our thing in LA together, kind of running up against those same walls. But as it happened, right when I kind of got the pull to move up here, she moved to London. So we now have this kind of interesting international presence where she's been putting roots down in London, and I've been doing stuff here, and we've been doing stuff together. And we've got some awesome women we've been working, collaborating with. And these last two films that we shot up in Washington, we did as learning sets where we had women come and students come and kind of shadow and learn on our set. And that really inspired both of us. So we're in the process of raising money to start a program that we're calling the Emerging Filmmakers Program. And essentially our goal with this program is to continue that, having female filmmaking teams, early career female filmmaking teams come, learn on our set. We'll pair them with an industry mentor, and then we will fully fund their first short film and their first micro budget feature, because we want to step in at that early stage where essentially, traditional investors are not interested, because those are such formative projects. So that's kind of what we're hoping, along with continuing obviously to develop and produce our projects and other women's projects. We're very excited about this program as well.
That's such a great opportunity for any young filmmaker, and to get that on-set experience, because it's hard to come by.
Yeah. And you learn so much. I mean, you learn so much by just being in the room. There's just certain things you can't learn in a classroom, you know? So yeah, it's exciting. And I think there's so much to be learned also because, you know, my background, I came through the micro budget world. So the first projects I did have all been quite low budget. Inheritance, we were able to up level to a bit more money, but learning how to do a project when you don't have a lot of money, I think is also such an incredible education because you really learn the value of resources and how to get things in creative ways and how to get your story told creatively when you can't necessarily get all of the flashes and the, you know, the fancy tools and the things. So I think there's a lot of value in that as well.
And so was Ingress the first film that you guys did through Emergence?
Yes, it's the first one we technically did through Emergence. And it's the first film that I ever directed as well, feature that I'd ever directed.
Gotcha. And that's streaming now, correct?
As of this week.
Well, congratulations. So where can people find it?
So currently it's on Amazon to rent or buy. And it's also on Vimeo on demand and Fandango at home, which is Vudu. Those are the main ones in the US only at the moment, but that'll expand more in November as it gets onto the, you know, subscription streaming platforms. But go rent or buy it because I think we make more money when people rent or buy it versus stream it, don't we?
You do. Yeah.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Well, very cool. So what is next for you? What are you currently working on, developing? Are you writing something new?
I am. So you might remember this, Peter, because you were the original inspiration for the seed of this idea, which has then lived with me for years, which is my female Western. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
That you had said you wanted to do a road trip movie. And then for some reason this like came out of my head. And I've sat with it for a lot of years. It's gone through many iterations. But in the last 6 months and since moving up to Washington, I kind of pulled it back out and it's morphing into this kind of witchy, feminist, queer Western thing that I now want to shoot up here in Washington. So I'm in the midst of the rewrites. And my hope is, obviously, pending all the stars aligning, is that we can film this next year and it can be the learning set for the first cycle of our filmmaker program as well. So we can do the film and then also launch that program for 2025.
Wow, that sounds awesome. So, I mean, it's not a traditional Western, but it's set in the 1800s, correct?
Yes.
So are you stepping up now that you've had some success with your films? You're kind of moving into higher budgets?
Yeah, I think so here's what I'll say about the budget thing. Like, everyone's always so impressed when you say, so we did Ingress for less than $100,000. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, so impressive. It is impressive. But the problem with it as a model is that what it essentially means at the end of the day is nobody got paid enough to live off of. So in my mind, what I promised myself and the crew who came and worked on that, and then Inheritance, is that each time I ask you to come back, I'll make sure we're getting closer to your actual living wage. Because there's only so many times you can ask people to come and work for you for pennies. It's important that artists make a living. So yeah. In my mind, we're going to keep doing our utmost to keep scaling up. I mean, not forever. We don't need to get up to $200 million Marvel level, but I want to at least get above, the $1 million, $1.5 million threshold. So we can actually have a little bit more to play with. And especially, period piece. We have some fire. We have some stunts. Like, I just want to make sure we're safe and we have enough time to do everything well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Very cool. So let me ask you this. With everything you're doing between writing, producing, starring in a lot of these films yourself, running this production company, how do you wind things down at night and quiet your brain so you get a good night's sleep?
That's a great question. I love a walk. I try to not be on screens after like 8 o'clock. Like usually, I'll watch a show or something. And then after that, I'll put my phone in my office and leave it in there, which has been huge for me. To not have access to my phone by my bed means I reach for something else instead of my phone. So I'll usually journal a little bit and then I'll read a book for a little while. And then that usually will do it.
Wow. That is impressive discipline. I think I need to move the phone.
Oh, it's impossible if you don't. Like, if it's next to me, it does not matter if there's literally nothing on my phone I have any interest in. I will pick it up anyway and like do something dumb. And the only reason I had it in my room was for my alarm. So I have an old iPod that I just set alarms on instead, which does nothing and is super slow. So I can't use it for anything other than an alarm.
Yeah. I mean, that's my excuse is I use it for an alarm.
Well, there you go. Now you don't have it as an excuse anymore.
Yeah. But I think it's really affected my attention span, and especially and very negatively affected my book reading discipline, because I can't have the phone anywhere near me if I'm reading a book.
Yeah. Because all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have to check this thing. It's critically important in your brain, and it's not. It's never important.
Right. And also, I feel like it's made it harder. You'll be reading a book, and sometimes, often books don't really get going right away. Okay. And I mean, this is something that we struggle with our kids, is reading, because they have iPads and devices, and they're used to short form, YouTube shorts and things like that. And I think what it does is it has hampered our ability to engage in long form and be patient with a narrative. And it's a bummer. And I think we're all fighting against it. I mean, my parents are addicted to their phones.
Interesting.
It's not just kids. It's like, it's everybody.
100%. Yeah.
So, well, cool. Well, Rachel, are you ready for your first story?
I'm ready.
The word, it's actually 2 words, is weird blob. Once upon a time, there was an old man named Vincent. And Vincent lived by himself in the woods, and he would go on walks every morning as part of his morning ritual. He would fix himself some tea. He would have a little bit of cantaloupe if it was in season, maybe some fresh bread from the local bakery with some apple butter spread on the bread if the apple butter was in season. I don't know if apple butter and cantaloupe are in season at the same time, but he enjoyed these things. He had a ritual every morning, like many old men do. And then he and his dog, Barkley, would go for a walk in the woods after he had had his breakfast and he had fed Barkley. And he loved going on these walks. He lived near the shore where the forest met the ocean. It was beautiful. There were high cliffs, tall trees. It was green constantly. And he would go out there, and he'd always have his binoculars with him. He was a curious old man, and he loved to be able to see beyond what others could see. And he specifically loved watching the birds. So one day, when he was on his hike with his dog Barkley, he heard a bird in the tree, in the distance. So he grabbed his binoculars, he placed them up against his eyes, and he looked out. But he was surprised to find not a bird on a tree limb, but it was this weird blob making bird noises, like it was imitating a bird. And he thought this was very strange because he had never seen anything like it. And he looked around. He thought maybe the sound could have come from another bird, but no, it was coming from this weird blob. So he was curious, remember. He was also a little bit frightened, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. And he had Barkley, who was a 90-pound black lab next to him. So he felt pretty safe approaching this weird blob.
What Vincent didn't know is that the binoculars that he had had for basically his entire life, that his father had given to him when he was a boy, were actually magic binoculars. And as he was looking at the weird blob on the tree branch, his finger brushed against a little lever on the bottom of the binoculars, and he was curious, and so he pressed it. And all of a sudden, the weird blob kind of shimmered, and all of a sudden, he was looking at a bird unlike anything he'd ever seen before. A bird from some kind of crazy fairy story. Almost didn't quite look like it was real. except that it was right in front of his face. So Vincent and Barkley, very cautiously, moved closer to the tree. Vincent kept checking the binoculars to make sure they didn't frighten off this strange fairy bird. They moved closer and closer, and Vincent pulled the binoculars up again. The bird was still there, and now it was looking at him. And just to make absolutely sure, Vincent flicked the little lever on the bottom of the binoculars again, and instead of a bird, he was looking again at that strange blob. So he didn't really know what to make of this, and a cold wind picked up all of a sudden, and he started to feel a little bit spooked. And so rather than pursue it further, Vincent whistled to Barkley. He took one more look at the strange blob, and then they turned around and headed back down the trail toward Vincent's house. In the distance behind him, he could still hear that strange imitation bird song coming from that strange fairy bird in that strange fairy tree.
And so he went into his house and tried to process what he had just seen and heard, but he couldn't quite wrap his brain around it. He thought maybe he had had some moldy bread or something that had led to a vivid hallucination, but he wasn't really sure what had happened. So he went about his business, fixing himself some lunch. And because he was a man of rituals, he would have the same lunch every day as well. He would have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, sometimes a peanut butter and apple butter sandwich. So he sat down in his favorite chair and ate his sandwich, and he drank a cold glass of milk. But he couldn't stop thinking about his morning and the blob that was a bird, that was also a blob, that was also a bird. It was all very confusing to him. Couldn't quite shake it, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. So after lunch, he of course took his afternoon nap first, because he always took a nap after lunch. He got up from his nap, he fixed himself another cup of tea, as he always did, and he and Barkley went back on that trail to investigate further. And they walked, and as they approached that tree, he raised those magic binoculars. His thumb flipped that switch on the bottom of the binoculars again, and instead of seeing a bird, he saw a bear cub. And he thought, this is the wildest thing. That bear cub is making bird noises. And then he flipped the lever again, and it was this weird blob. It must be something I ate, he said to Barkley, and Barkley just looked at him, because Barkley only understood a few human words, like walk and treat. Vincent didn't really care. He would often speak in complete sentences to Barkley like he was a human. So he thought, what am I going to do? There's this bear cub. I don't want to approach it because where there's a cub, there's probably a mama. The mama's going to get angry. I don't know what to do. So he went back to his house. That night, he fixed himself dinner, went to bed, and then the next morning,
Vincent woke up the way he always did. He sat up, put on his glasses, slipped his feet into his slippers, and gave a big stretch. Barkley lay on the floor beside him when all of a sudden his ears pricked up. And Vincent, too, heard that same strange bird call coming this time from right outside the window. Vincent very quietly slipped across the room and grabbed those magic binoculars. And then he quickly pulled the curtain aside, and there, sitting on the windowsill, was that strange shimmering blob. This time it was about the size of a small child. So Vincent lifted those binoculars and he flipped the switch. First, it was a fairy bird. He flipped it again. A bear cub. He flipped it again. Nothing. He flipped it again. And this time, it was a small child with wings. He flipped it again. Nothing. And all of a sudden, Vincent realized that what he was seeing was actually his own imagination, and that this blob could become anything that he could think up, and that perhaps he could create something that would make his day and Barkley's day even brighter. And so he closed his eyes and he thought really hard, and then he looked back through those binoculars and flipped the switch, and there in front of them both was a fantastic feast of apple butter, peanut butter, and dog treats. And they happily took it inside, and they had the best breakfast of their lives. The end.
Rachel, are you ready for one more story?
I'm ready.
All right. The word is button.
Once upon a time, there was a woman named Silvara, and she had a little shop at the edge of a cute little town that made buttons and laces and lace and all of the things that the women of the town would come to buy to make their dresses a little fancier and a little more fun for when they had parties or occasions. Silvara lived by herself, but she had always dreamed of meeting someone who loved to tinker as much as she did. And sometimes at night, she would curl up in her bed with her little cat, Puffin, and together they would dream about who that person might be and how that person might one day walk into the shop and change Silvara's life. But for now, nothing changed, and life was pretty routine for Silvara. She would wake up in the morning, make Puffin some fish, and then she would open up her shop. As the sun rose in the sky each morning, she would go through a carefully etched routine. She would open all of the curtains and gently tie them back with red lace that she had made and dyed herself. She would open the window to let the breeze in, and Puffin would happily leap up onto the windowsill and watch the birds. She would then unlock the front door and open it up to welcome people in from the outside. The neighbors across the way were very friendly, and they would always give her a wave in the morning, and sometimes the baker, whose name was Jill, would bring Silvara some of the extra bits that didn't quite make it into the shop that morning, so she could always count on a lovely breakfast of fresh pastries to start her day. Silvara loved all things lace. She loved to sew and to knit and to crochet, but her favorite thing in all the world were buttons. She never knew why, but there was something about them that just made her feel very happy. She had a giant bin of them in the back of the shop, all different shapes and sizes and colors, and she would go through that bin and select the perfect button for each customer that came into the shop. It was Silvara's belief, and she didn't really know where this belief came from, that each button had a specific person that it was meant for, and she took a great amount of pleasure in seeking out the perfect button for each customer that came into the shop. Her first customer of the day that morning was a married couple named Bill and Sophie, and they had a wedding to attend. Sophie had a lovely pair of black boots that were in need of some buttons, and one in particular that would be decorative for her dress and match the buttons on her shoes. So Silvara pulled that bin of buttons out, and she began to sift through them one by one, letting them fall through her fingers, until she found a beautiful button that had texture. It was black and white, and it had a little carving of a woman's face in the center. When she held it up to Sophie, Sophie's eyes lit up in delight, and she knew that she had found the right one. So she carefully sewed this button onto Sophie's shirt. Her husband stood by watching, a little jealously, because he too wanted a button, but he was a little bit embarrassed to ask. Silvara could tell, and so she, before they left, went back into her bin of buttons and sifted through until she found the perfect button for the husband. And this one was a lovely pair to the button she had sewed on Sophie's dress as well. So they paid her, and they went about their day. And Sophie cleaned the shop, and she sewed, and she knitted, and she ate some bits of pastry, and she waited for her next customer. Later that day, after she had sold buttons to several other customers, She decided she needed to get out of the shop for a moment. So she left Puffin inside. She took a basket with her in case she found anything interesting along the way. And then she went for a walk. She walked through town the way she always did, walking by the familiar shops, the people whose faces she knew so well, seeing so many people wearing things that she had helped to create for them, and that made her happy. But still, deep in her heart, she felt this emptiness, this feeling like there was a button out there in the world that was meant for her, and she hadn't found it yet, and it certainly wasn't in her bin of buttons back in her shop. So she continued her walk into the forest where she sometimes got her inspiration. And she walked through looking for pebbles and mushrooms and interesting shells which sometimes blew in or were carried in by seagulls from the ocean, which wasn't far away. As she was walking, she began to think again about this person that she hoped she would meet. And she wondered how she might find them or how they might find her. Just then, something pulled her eyes down to the base of a tree. And at the base of the tree was a beautiful golden mushroom. And next to it was a pebble that was bright blue. Something about the combination of colors really drew her eye, and so she kneeled down and she picked up the stone and the mushroom, and she put them in her basket. She turned around to head home, when all of a sudden a storm blew in. The wind picked up, and she felt fat raindrops begin to fall on her head. She took shelter under a tree to wait out the storm, and as she was waiting, she heard suddenly the sound of horses' hooves in the distance, and then a loud whinny as a bit of lightning lit up the sky, and a big clap of thunder made her jump. Suddenly silhouetted, she saw a man astride a horse. But then the lightning flash went away, and he was gone. She looked down into her basket, and suddenly, instead of one pebble, the basket was full to the brim of buttons, all with that same blue color. She didn't know what to make of this, but as she sifted through them, she had this very distinct feeling that somewhere amidst all these blue buttons was a blue button that was meant just for her. So she took the basket and she hurried back to the shop before the rain came back because she didn't want to be wet. When she got back to the shop, she closed the door and put the sign to closed because she felt that she needed to spend the afternoon seeking through these buttons to see what she could find. She poured them out on the floor in front of her, and Puffin took a great interest in all of these buttons on the floor and immediately pounced on them and began to play. Silvara tried to scare him off, but he was persistent, and so she decided to let him help her. Together, they sifted all the buttons out. At a distance, they all looked to be about the same, but when you looked closely, as Silvara was wont to do, since she loved buttons, you could tell that each of them were a little bit different. And it was those differences that really interested her, so she started to put them into piles. All of the ones that had 3 holes went in one pile. The buttons that were slightly misshapen went in another. And as she sifted through all of these buttons, her eyes landed on one button in particular that just seemed to set itself apart from the others. She couldn't explain why, but she knew beyond a doubt that that button was for her. And so she gently picked it up, and she took a needle and thread, and she sewed that button onto the collar of her shirt. As soon as she'd done that, she felt a little silly because nothing happened. So she and Puffin went about their evening. They made dinner. They curled up in their little bed, and they went to sleep. But that night, as Silvara slept, that button on her collar began to glow. And Silvara dreamed again of the stranger in the forest on his horse. But this time, she saw his face, and it was a lovely face, and it turned to her with a big smile, and it beckoned her to come toward him. When Silvara woke up, before she even opened her eyes, she knew that something had changed. She sat up, and she felt Puffin jump up beside her, and when she opened her eyes, there was the man, standing at the kitchen sink, making her breakfast. And when he turned to look at her, she knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that he was her button and she was his. The end.